So first things first, the whole reason I'm making this video is because there's another video on Joel's channel which is actually worth watching. So Joel's into Yu-Gi-Oh! And he enjoys watching through a progression series where they start with the very first set of cards that were ever released, play a round of games with them, then add on the next release of cards, and so on. A couple of years ago he had me try it out. I wasn't really feeling it too much, so we stopped after only a few games. But then a couple weeks ago I suggested trying to do the same thing for the Pokemon card game. We wrangled Autumn into it, and plan to go through the card expansions until such a point where we probably end up getting sick of it and then just kind of stop, but in the meantime it's at least worth trying. So, we each opened up our virtual card packs, played a best 2 out of 3 game against each other, and then Joel spent like 40 hours editing it down and presenting it in an actually professional-looking format. Aside from the 40 hours of editing, it was really fun, and I look forward to going through the next expansion and making this a thing. So basically, I'm just making this video to be sort of a companion piece to that one. The other one does go into some detail on specific cards from the base set, and you can probably figure out most of the rules by watching the games, but I figured people might still want some further context if you've never played the card game and don't know how it works. So this is basically just explaining how to play the game. Obviously, there's plenty of other resources that you could also look at, but I figured people would be less likely to want to look those up, since it would kind of feel like homework, whereas if I make this, it's more like, hey, watch this if you want a basic rundown, instead of just telling you to go look somewhere else. To start, both players have exactly 60 cards in their deck. There's 3 basic categories of cards: Pokemon, Trainers, and Energy. Pokemon do what you'd probably expect. I'll get into their interactions later. Trainer cards can be items from the video games, characters, locations, or just other abstract concepts. These are typically a one-time use effect that can be played at any time to either give you an advantage or to disrupt the opponent. Building a solid team of Pokemon is important for a good deck, but choosing what trainer cards to focus on is equally important. The energy cards are needed for the Pokemon to use their moves. Most of these cards aren't very flashy, but they are very important. It doesn't really matter how many of each type of card you have in your deck, but it's usually risky to have less than 20 energy, and you'll generally want at least as many trainers as you have Pokemon. Because energy is an important resource, it's best to not focus on more than 2 Pokemon types per deck, since otherwise it'll be too unlikely to get the type of energy that you need when you need it. I'll be explaining the different types of cards in more detail later. At the start of the game, both players draw 7 cards for their hand. If there's no basic, unevolved Pokemon within your hand, then you have to show it to your opponent and try again, and then they get to draw an extra card if they want. Once you have a usable hand, you put a Pokemon face down as your active Pokemon. You can put up to 5 more on the bench, which are your reserve Pokemon that you can switch to. Then you make the top 6 cards of the deck your prize cards, which sit face down until you're allowed to draw them. So you've got your hand, your active Pokemon, and the opponent's defending Pokemon, both benches, the prize cards, the decks, and the discard piles. Each turn you draw a card. You can attach 1 energy card to one of your Pokemon. You can play as many trainer cards as you want, and then you end your turn by using a move. There are no turn interruptions like in Yu-Gi-Oh! This goes back and forth until there's a winner, and there's 3 different win conditions. One is to KO every Pokemon that the opponent has in play. Even if they have another one in their hand, if it's not out on the field, then it doesn't count. Another is to draw all 6 of your prize cards. Whenever you KO an enemy Pokemon, you get one of the prizes, so it's basically this game's equivalent of the 6 Pokemon team that you would have in the video games. The other win condition is more of a lose condition. If a player has no cards left in their deck at the start of their turn when they're supposed to draw a card, then they automatically lose. In the card sets released throughout the first generation of Pokemon, there are 7 types. The 15 Pokemon types from the video games basically got condensed down to keep things simpler. The normal, flying, and dragon types got grouped into colorless. The fighting, ground, and rock types got grouped into fighting. Fire is just fire. The grass, bug, and poison types got grouped into grass. The electric type got renamed to lightning for some reason, but otherwise is unchanged. The psychic and ghost types got grouped into psychic. And the water and ice types got grouped into water. This is how it worked for Gen 1. As the game progressed, more and more types would actually get introduced or switched around. In Gen 2, the darkness and metal types came out, which are the I'm too cool for my original name versions of Dark and Steel. In Gen 4, Poison types started being branded as Psychic instead of Grass. Partway through Gen 5, Dragon became its own type, so it was no longer colorless. In Gen 6, the Fairy type was added. And then in Gen 8, the Fairy type got removed, and so Pokemon that were Fairy are now Psychic, which would mean that there were 4 different types that are now under the Psychic category, except for the fact that Poison changed again and is now considered part of Darkness. Poison kinda just can't make up its mind. For now, a Pokemon can only have one type. Usually the primary one, but it can be the secondary. It kinda just depends from one Pokemon to the next. An important distinction between the card game and the video games is that every attack is the same type as the Pokemon using it. So if you have a water type and it uses a move like Tackle, it's still considered a water attack when you're applying weakness and resistance, even if the move doesn't use water energy. So let's talk about energy for a bit. Of the 7 types that exist in the Gen 1 card game, 6 of them are considered basic energy. They're the only cards that you can have more than 4 of in a deck. Everything else does have that limitation, including non-basic energy cards. Every turn you can place 1 energy card from your hand onto a Pokemon. Certain card effects might let you attach more, but most of the time it's only 1. Usually the only moves that require only 1 energy are pretty weak, so you'll be starting out with those and then try to build up to stronger ones as quickly as possible, which makes the early game a bit slower before it picks up momentum. Most attacks don't consume energy when used, but some do, and the consumed energy goes into the discard pile, where it's impossible to get back unless you use cards specifically designed to retrieve it. Energy can also get discarded as a result of certain attacks from the opponent or trainer cards used on you. It also has to be discarded in order to retreat most Pokemon to the bench, so it's always an important resource to manage. One important thing to know about energy is how the colorless type works. Whenever an attack says it requires a certain amount of colorless energy, what that actually means is it just needs that amount of any type of energy attached. It doesn't matter what kind is used. The reverse is not true, though. If a move requires a certain type of energy to be used, let's say fire, attaching a colorless energy card will not meet that requirement. A rainbow energy would, but those don't exist until the rocket set. And as mentioned before, the type of attack being used is determined by the type of the Pokemon, so a colorless Pokemon will always be dealing colorless damage, even though it's generally going to have some sort of other type of energy attached. Trainer cards have a wide variety of different effects, especially as the game progresses and more are released, so there's really no point in trying to describe what they all do, since they're pretty different from each other. For now, at least, most of them are a one-time use ability that either helps your Pokemon, lets you manipulate the cards in your hand, deck, and discard pile, or disrupts the opponent. Some can be attached to a Pokemon as a temporary power-up. And in later sets, we'll see different types of trainer cards, like the Stadium cards, which apply a new rule to the game that sticks around until they're replaced by a different stadium. The most important thing to know about trainer cards is that there's no limit to how many you can play in a turn. So sometimes you can chain together a ton of different effects before your attack and drastically change the flow of the game just in that one turn. Unless I wanted to try to explain a bunch of individual cards here, that's pretty much all I can say about them for now. Pokemon cards are the main attraction of the game, so let's break down how they work. The first distinction is between basic Pokemon and evolutions. A basic Pokemon is unevolved and can be played immediately as soon as you have it in your hand. Many of them are pretty weak, but there are some that can hold their own quite well, including the legendaries. Evolution stages in the card game are referred to as Basic, Stage 1, and Stage 2. So what you might think of as a third stage Pokemon like Charizard is just called Stage 2. You can't evolve a Pokemon on its first turn in play, but after that, as long as you have the card in hand, you can evolve it. Evolution cures all status effects, but it doesn't remove damage. Earlier, when I talked about decks only allowing 4 of any given card, the official ruling on that is that you can only have 4 of any card of the same name. Both the base set and the first expansion, which was Jungle, have a Pikachu card, and they have different stats and moves. But both of them are called Pikachu, so although you can have some of both, your total number of Pikachu cards can't exceed 4. However, later sets will start introducing Pokemon with modifiers in their names, like Dark Raichu or Lieutenant Surge's Raichu. Because those technically have different names and aren't just Raichu, you could have 4 of each in a deck. Not that it would be a good idea to do so, but it wouldn't be against the rules. Every Pokemon has an HP value and a type, which shouldn't really need explanation. It will have at least one move and or Pokemon power, which are going to be very different from one Pokemon to the next. And then there's the 3 values at the bottom of the card, which can sometimes be left blank. Most Pokemon have a weakness, which means that if they get attacked by that type, they take double damage. Some have a resistance, which lowers incoming attacks of that type by 30 damage, meaning that weak attacks will be completely blocked. Weakness and resistance are determined per Pokemon, not per type, so different Pokemon of the same type might have different types that they're good or bad against, but it usually follows some sort of general rules though. Here's a type chart that generally breaks down the type interactions in the cards, at least from the first 4 sets. I haven't really looked at anything past Rocket yet. If you look at this, you'll notice that the resistances from the video games are basically not in here, and the immunities have become the new resistances. Those are mostly the same, except normal can hit ghost here, and for some reason Dragon is considered immune to psychic/ghost. As for the weaknesses, there's not as many as there are in the video games, basically just to give every type 1 or 2 advantages without going too overboard. The most noteworthy ones are Psychic being super effective against itself, probably to represent Ghost beating Psychic, even though Gen 1 was bugged and it didn't work correctly. And Water being the only type that kind of changes weakness depending on the card. For most other types, it's pretty consistent, but for Water, it's kind of split down the middle, where some are weak to Grass and some are weak to Lightning. There's a few other weird interactions, such as Beedrill and Venomoth, essentially counting as flying types because they resist fighting. There are no pure ice types in Gen 1, so I actually can't tell what the type interactions with that one are. And the legendary birds actually have no weakness, at least in the early cards, even though they should be weak to rock or some of the other types, they just don't have one yet. So back to looking at the card. The retreat cost is how much energy must be discarded off the Pokemon for it to swap with a different Pokemon on the bench. Usually stronger Pokemon have a higher retreat cost, but it also sometimes has a correlation with their speed stat from the video games. Attacks are usually straightforward. Some have no extra text at all and just deal the amount of damage listed. Some involve coin flips to add an element of chance, some can inflict a status effect, which I'll get to in a minute, some have a cost to use, some have recoil damage or can damage Pokemon on the bench, and some just have some other miscellaneous property, but there's way too many different kinds of those to explain all of them. In later sets they start getting a bit more complicated, but at least at the start they're usually pretty straightforward. So as for status effects, or conditions as they're called in the card game, there's 4 different kinds: sleep, paralysis, confusion, and poison. They work similar to how they do in the video games, but not exactly the same. For one thing, in the video games, confusion is considered a minor status and it can be stacked with the others, but in the card game, poison is the one that can be stacked with others. Sleep, paralysis, and confusion are all mutually exclusive. If a Pokemon has one of those and then gets hit by an attack that would inflict a different one, it'll be overwritten by the new one, instead of failing like it does in the video games. Sleep and paralysis are pretty similar. Both prevent the Pokemon from using a move, and both prevent retreating. The main difference is in how they get cured. For sleep, every time either player's turn ends, a coin flip determines if the Pokemon wakes up. So it could wake up immediately, or it could go on forever, depending on luck. For paralysis, the Pokemon is guaranteed exactly 1 turn of inaction. If it starts a turn paralyzed, the status goes away as soon as that turn ends. Confusion changed a bit after Gen 2, but for now, here's how it works. In order to attack or retreat, you have to win a coin flip, in which case it plays out exactly like it would normally. If you get a Tails when trying to attack, you damage yourself for 20 HP. If you get a Tails when trying to retreat, you pay the retreat cost, but don't actually get to switch. Confusion never goes away on its own. You have to either successfully switch out or cure it with a trainer card or some other ability. Starting in Gen 3, the rules changed a bit so that you don't actually pay the retreat cost if you flip a Tails, but the self-damage was buffed to 30. Poison is pretty simple. It just deals 10 damage to the Pokemon between every turn. It can be cured by switching, but otherwise it never goes away on its own. And for now, that's the last major status effect. Burn wouldn't be introduced until late into Gen 2, and then there's a bunch of other minor conditions, like having your type temporarily changed, which revert to normal after switching, but those are just dependent on specific cards, and there's no way to really list all of them. The only other major thing I've failed to address so far are the Pokemon powers. These are basically equivalent to the abilities that Pokemon would get in the video game starting in Gen 3. They'd eventually be renamed to that in the card game too. Like with the trainer cards, there's too much variance in what these can do to really attempt to summarize them. Most of them are passive abilities that can be triggered as long as the Pokemon is in play, even if it's on the bench. Most of them also get disabled if the Pokemon is asleep, confused, or paralyzed. Some Pokemon powers are impactful enough to warrant building a deck around them, so it's always important to read exactly what they do. As the card game progresses and more expansions are added, I'm sure there will be tons of new rules and categories of cards that'll start popping up that I haven't explained here, but those will presumably be discussed in the openings of the episodes that introduce them. One last thing to explain about the card game is how it rotates sets. At the beginning of the game's history, we started with the base set, then Jungle, then Fossil, then base set 2, which was just reprints of some existing cards. Then we had Team Rocket, Gym Heroes, and Gym Challenge. That was the final set that used just the original 151 Pokemon, and by my count, there were 531 unique cards released in English between them, including a few that weren't tournament legal. Partway through the Gen 2 expansions, there was a format change, which dropped the first 4 card sets from competitive play, so you could only use cards from the Rocket set onward. After a couple new expansions, the Legendary Collection was released, which reprinted a selection of cards from the first 4 unique sets again, just in time for Rocket and the 2 gym sets to be dropped. There was no consistent pattern that determined when older sets would be dropped or how many of them would be dropped, but this would continue throughout the lifespan of the whole game. At least until recently, when they started making it more convoluted, with specific cards being rotated out instead of entire expansions, but that's a whole other can of worms to deal with way later. But anyway, this list of exactly what sets were allowed to be played at any given time will be followed as we progress through the expansions. With the reprints in Base Set 2 and Legendary Collection, things can sometimes get a little weird. The 2002-2003 modified format dropped Team Rocket, but Legendary Collection had just come out, which reprinted some of the Rocket cards. So some of those were legal, but not all of them were. And to make it even more confusing, as long as some version of a specific card is legal, all prints of that card are. So if you have a Dark Slowbro that you pulled way back in the Rocket set, but you didn't get a new one in Legendary Collection, you can still use the old one anyway because it's considered the same card, even if the set symbol or even the artwork is different. There's even some promotional cards that weren't part of an expansion that either got reprinted in an actual set later on, or were already a reprint of an older card to begin with. It gets a little messy, and we'll have to pay attention to cases like this as we go through the sets. Anyway, that's it. Go watch the actual thing on Joel's channel. It's good.